Hello, and welcome to Western Civ, episode 214, Henry and Francis and Charles, oh my. Last time we brought Charles V, the now Holy Roman Emperor, onto our board. In terms of Western Europe, we now have our major players ready and situated to begin the tumultuous 1520s. Francis is fresh from his victory at Marciano and his failed effort to become the Holy Roman Emperor. Henry is still desperately searching for his first real military triumph, while he seeks to avoid the plague and produce an heir. And Charles V, well, he still has to deal with Martin Luther. The 1520s are going to be the most tumultuous decade in Europe since the Black Death that swept the continent between 1347 and 1352. In many ways, a lot of the changes that will hit Europe during this time have been coming down the pipeline since the days when Yesenia Pestes first upset the apple cart that was medieval Christendom. There's going to be a lot of back and forth in the next few episodes as we follow events in Europe from three different perspectives. So hold on tight. By defeating Francis I in the battle for the imperial throne, Charles had created a dangerous enemy. The rift between Charles V and Francis I would be the defining feature of political life in Western Europe all the way through Francis's death in 1547. Today, we remember the Reformation as being the issue that divided Europeans in the 16th century. But for most Europeans, that issue was actually the division between France and the Habsburgs. The wars that Europeans fought through 1550 were not, by and large, grand religious wars. That age is still coming. These wars were between two rivals locked in a deadly struggle for European dominance. For his part, Charles found the conflict personally frustrating. He never asked to get into a bidding war with Francis for the position of emperor, and his grandfather had specifically listed Charles as his heir in his will. On the other side of the coin, for Francis, this was all personal, and he really hated Charles. His feelings would only grow over time. Henry VIII functioned in a space between these two men and their rivalry. Cardinal Wolsey favored a match with France and sought to alienate Henry from Charles. But Charles was Queen Catherine's nephew, which gave him a natural connection to the English court. As we will talk about in a moment, by January 1520, Wolsey was working on arranging an elaborate visit between Francis and Henry. Charles decided he would visit England on his own after a trip to the Netherlands, not wanting to be left out in the cold. But before he could do any of that, Charles needed to settle things in Spain. The Castilian nobility remained frustrated with Charles's style of leadership, which, by and large, was to use Flemish underlings to manage affairs in Spain. This decision, as you can imagine, did not endear Charles to his Spanish subjects. During the winter of 1519-1520, the Castilian patriots coalesced around the recommendations of a committee of theologians from the city of Salamanca. They wanted Charles to marry and produce an heir before committing himself to further overseas adventures. Plus, they demanded that no further taxes be voted, and that any Castilian money be spent in Castile. They also argued that the defense of Castile ultimately lay with the comunidades, by which they meant the collective representative body of the people made up by the various towns, universities, and guilds of Castile. Eventually, their complaints boiled over into what historians call the Revolt of the Comunidades, or much more commonly, the Comunero Revolt. in an age that was increasingly seeing monarchs insist on their divine right to rule, Castile was drawing the line in the political sand. Now, Charles badly needed to keep Spain under his control. Not only was it a crucial part of his birthright, but now there were serious rumors coming back to Europe of major wealth in the New World. Suddenly, Charles had a solution to his money problems. The gold and silver of the New World, namely Mexico, would function like an ATM, with which Charles could just pay all his bills, and, after the imperial election, he had a lot of those. But first, Charles had to hold on to Castile. At Valladolid, the Castilian nobility pressed Charles to remain in Spain until he had sired an heir. But instead of figuring out a way to nuance the situation, Charles reacted, threatening to have a member of the local nobility beheaded for his impudence. The meeting broke up, and the Castilian nobility promptly rode home to rouse the countryside to their cause. Charles reacted just as fast. He and a small group of royal advisors and men-at-arms immediately made for Tordesillas, where Charles's mother Juana the Mad was kept in quasi-imprisonment. Technically, Charles ruled Castile through his mother, so he needed her in his custody. But when they arrived, the party found the doors barred. Quickly surrounded and outnumbered by local Castilians, Charles had to fight his way out before taking off in haste for safety. The following day, a contingent from Salamanca came to see Charles and begged him to remain in Spain until matters could be resolved. Or, if he couldn't, to allow the towns more representation in government and call a Cortes, kind of like a parliament, in the heart of Castile, and not to attempt any further tax increases. But by now, Charles was surrounded by his Flemish retinue and in an overconfident mood. He decided to continue his progress and would hold the Cortes in Santiago far to the northwest, as originally planned. The Bishop of Badajoz opened the Cortes with a rousing speech, hoping to get the representatives present on Charles' side. He said Charles had not accepted the imperial crown personally, but in order to battle the, quote, heathen enemies of our holy Catholic faith. Few people bought it. Only the Andalusian cities of Granada and Seville were firm in their support of Charles. Everywhere else, he faced the very real prospect of armed rebellion. But at the Cortes, Charles, at least on the surface, got what he wanted. Cash. After expelling the most difficult members of the nobility, he won over the majority of those who remained with threats and no shortage of bribery. As a result, the Cortes agreed to a further tax, which, incidentally, would never actually be collected. To Charles, that didn't matter. Once granted the tax, Charles borrowed 400,000 ducats against it, enough to pay his immediate expenses. Borrowing against Castilian tax revenue would be something of a Habsburg practice that would continue even beyond 1648. In the end, Charles had won the battle but not the war. This is indicative of the difficult position that Charles would always find himself in. On paper, he was invincible. If you just looked at a map of everything that he ruled, it's like 70% of Europe. But in early modern Europe, where war was prohibitively expensive, at times his empire was too expensive for him to use it effectively. This was not the Roman Empire of the Caesars. Every part of Charles's empire had its own government. And, as in the case we just witnessed, these parts of the empire balked at the idea of paying for the others. What did it matter to someone in Castile if there was a war in the German states. Why should they pay for it? Coordinating all these disparate parts of his domains would ultimately prove too much for Charles, and he would abdicate. But we're not there yet. On May the 20th, 1520, Charles finally set sail for England. He hoped to convince Henry to remain on his side, or, saving that, at least remain neutral between himself and Francis. He thought that his issues with Castile were over. As we will see, he was wrong. After the failure of his attempt to become Holy Roman Emperor, Francis was now seen in Europe as yesterday's man. Europe's attention, especially to Francis, now seemed to have turned decidedly away from him and toward Charles. This was a severe disappointment to a man who, less than 5 years after his epic victory at Marciano, saw himself relegated to second place. Without a military campaign to pursue, or, frankly, the funds to pursue one, Francis found the lack of inertia at the French court suffocating. His feelings of entrapment tended to bubble at the surface in inopportune times. For example, when showing the Cardinal Federico Gonzaga around his chateau at Blois, he found himself unable to open a door. So he, in perfectly reasonable fashion, broke it down with his shoulder. You know, like a sane person would. Francis was desperate to continue his reputation as a strong man, but it turned out that not every challenge was easily subdued as, say, a door. While out hunting in September 1519, he was nearly blinded while riding pell-mell after a boar. His eyes survived, but he was struck on the head with a branch and thrown from his horse. And then there continued to be the pressing issue of Naples, which, it's important to remember, also included the island of Sicily. Charles's grandfather had ruled Naples until his death in 1519. However, by paying tribute to Francis for Naples, and by including it in Princess Charlotte's dowry, Charles seems to have implicitly recognized Francis's claim to the kingdom. In the end, though, none of this mattered, and both men knew it. The right to rule Naples had to be conferred by the Pope, so Leo X would get to make the final call. After Marciano, Leo had led Francis to believe that he might be able to claim the kingdom after all. But in light of Charles's election as Holy Roman Emperor, now late in 1519, Leo recognized the crown of Naples as united with the empire. Francis was out in the cold. The odds that Francis would obtain a decided advantage on the continent were now at an end. Charles, on paper, had the most lands, but also the most debt. Furthermore, each of Charles's dominions wanted to look after its own interests. Francis and Henry remained powerful counterbalances to Charles, though the question remained whether or not the two would work together or in opposition to one another. Nearly 80 years later, Sir Francis Bacon would write, "During the triumvirate of kings, King Henry VIII of England, Francis I, King of France, and Charles V, Emperor, there was such a good watch kept that none of the three could win a palm of ground, but the other two would straightways balance it, either by confederation or, if need were, by war, and would not in any wise take up peace at interest." Back in England, Henry VIII's preoccupation with the imperial election had caused his meeting with Francis to be postponed until the following year, 1520. Henry was not personally offended at Charles's electoral victory, as he seems to have reckoned the office wasn't worth the cost. Affairs in Henry's personal household continued down their tumultuous path. While it would be a mistake to suggest that Catherine's influence over her husband had completely waned, it had not. But the 6-year age gap between them was becoming increasingly obvious. Henry was still very much romantically involved with Elizabeth Blount, who in June 1519 bore Henry a son, Henry Fitzroy. Now, normally royalty did not acknowledge children born out of wedlock, but it seems like Henry felt his lack of a male heir was a deliberate stain on his manhood. So he abandoned all discretion and acknowledged the boy. Wolsey was made responsible for his care, though the boy remained with his mother during his childhood years. Elizabeth Blount, henceforth referred to as, quote, the mother of the king's son, did not return to court, nor does she appear to have resumed her affair with the king. This absolutely contradicts the popular image of a sex-crazed Henry trying to sleep with as many women as possible. Rather, it appears that Henry's desire for a male heir was 100% genuine. Once Elizabeth gave him Henry Fitzroy as a sort of insurance policy, he only wanted her to see after the child. Henry wasn't about to divorce Catherine for Elizabeth Blount, so there was no need for her to come back to court. I really don't think we dispute the genuine need Henry felt for a male heir in the weight that he felt carrying on the Tudor dynasty. To our modern sensibilities, sure, Henry's use of women to get his heir was deplorable. But to the contemporary English, what they wanted to do was avoid another War of the Roses. They wanted peace and stability, and that meant a male heir. Henry's interests in this regard were essentially the same as England's. I'm not trying to excuse Henry's behavior here. For the record, you should not cheat on your spouse. But I wanted to make it clear that Henry was not just an ordinary man, and his desire for a son must therefore be placed in the proper context. At some point after Henry's affair with Elizabeth Blount ended, he took up with Mary Boleyn. Henry conducted this affair with so much discretion that the only reason we know about it at all is because in 1528, Henry will ask the Pope for a dispensation so he can marry Anne Boleyn, because he was within the forbidden degrees of affinity with her, having had sexual intercourse with her sister. While Mary bore a daughter in March of 1526 that was said to have resembled the king in looks, the affair was probably over by then, as by 1526, Henry was infatuated with her sister Anne. Anyway, after autumn 1519, Henry invited back to court most of those dismissed gentlemen that Wolsey had intentionally removed. These men returned to serve alongside the yes-men Wolsey had put in place, somewhat diluting the advantage he had created for himself. Wolsey still favored diplomatic relations with Francis, and the two kingdoms had agreed to a marriage alliance in April of that year. On March the 31st, 1519, Claude had given birth to a baby boy, the future French king, Henri II. England and France agreed that the child would be betrothed to Princess Mary, the daughter of Henry and Queen Catherine. An alliance between England and France appeared closer than ever. But before Henry and France's pivotal meeting at the Field of Cloth of Gold, Charles arrived for a visit. At the time of Charles's visit, Henry was actually growing his beard out in Francis's honor. The arrangement was that the two men would not shave until their meeting. This irritated Catherine on several grounds, but mostly because she favored closer ties to her nephew, Charles. In May 1520, Henry left Norfolk and old Bishop Fox, who had come out of retirement to help out, in charge of England, and traveled to Dover, where he would meet the emperor and then depart for France. On May the 26th, 1520, the emperor arrived, and Charles walked ashore to a thunderous salute from the English fleet. Charles was lodged in Dover Castle, and Henry arrived late in the night and immediately went to see Charles, quote, where they embraced each other familiarly. During his visit, Charles launched on an full-out charm offensive. He wanted England to ally with him against Francis. He gave Wolsey a large pension and promised him, upon the death of Pope Leo, he would make Wolsey's dream come true and see him elected the next pope. Leaving the discussions open, Henry agreed that he would meet with the emperor again in imperial territory after his meeting with Francis. However, said charm offensive had worked, and Charles had, for the moment, once more, outflanked Francis. Whether it was Charles's Mexican gold, tales from the New World, Catherine's influence, or his personality, Charles had managed to convince Henry to agree to a marriage alliance between himself and Princess Mary. After all, why marry your daughter to the potential future king of France when you could marry the current emperor and king of Spain? Henry agreed, but the two men decided to keep their agreement secret, lest all of Christendom suddenly become aware of how quickly Charles's star was rising. Unfortunately for Charles, his promise to marry the princess would be fulfilled far too late to right the ship in his later years. Now it was time for Henry and Francis to meet in person. The two sides agreed that the meeting would take place 6 miles from Calais, at a place called the Val d'Or, or Golden Vale. Henry would be based on one side, at the English-held town of Guinness, and Francis would launch in Ardèze on the other. An enormous amount of money had been spent preparing the site for both kings' arrival. Built in less than 3 months, the, quote, Palace of Illusions was one of the lost treasures of the early modern world. It was built on a 328-foot quadrangular plain, complete with a gatehouse, battlements, dining hall, and much, much more. The whole edifice was constructed on top of brick and timber masonry, with canvas attached above it, painted to make the whole thing look like a real stone castle. Hence the name, Palace of Illusions. The whole display was referred to many as the 8th wonder of the world. Henry's bill for his half was £15,000, about $5.5 million in today's money. Francis was less well off than Henry financially, and it took the French 10 years to pay off their share. Francis, for all the attempts at secrecy, was aware of Henry's meeting with Charles. He was not to be outdone, and arrived at Ardèze with an entourage of 5,000 courtiers. Beneath all the spectacle of the meeting, there were very real tensions. Henry was very much a maiden to be wooed. No one knew if he would support Francis or Charles. Whichever side he chose, the other would be outnumbered, especially given that England was famously wealthy. On June the 7th, 1520, the two men arrived. Both secretly suspected the other of violence, so each came prepared for battle. Henry, wearing a broadcloth of gold and silver, appeared surrounded by his yeomen of the guard. Francis, also in a cloth of gold and silver, was flanked by Swiss guardsmen. Here, quote, they greeted each other like truly well-intentioned people, and then with evident satisfaction, talked together in a friendly fashion until evening. There followed 2 weeks of feasting, jousting, dancing, and games, wherein each court vied for supremacy. One Venetian observer commented on the farcical nature of the proceedings. Quote, these sovereigns are not at peace. They hate each other cordially. He was right about the overly chivalric nature of everything. Henry and Francis observed every courtesy toward one another. When an English herald began to read out a proclamation beginning, I, Henry, by the grace of God, King of England and France, Henry stopped him. He turned to Francis and said, "I cannot be while you are here, for I would be a liar." For the duration of the visit, Henry made sure he would be only addressed as the King of England. This was a Renaissance scene like no other. What mattered at the Field of the Cloth of Gold was the symbolism. Here were two monarchs whose kingdoms had only finished fighting the 100 Years' War against each other less than 75 years before. Times had changed. Francis was 25, Henry was 28. Both were good-humored and energetic men who enjoyed the pleasures of food, drink, and sex. Both were aspiring Renaissance princes who wanted to be seen as connoisseurs of art and literature. And both had ample opportunity to show off their prowess. Before the actual first meeting and feast, which took place on the feast day of Corpus Christi, June the 7th, the two sides had already hammered out all the treaty details. On June 6th, both kings signed an agreement that Francis would pay Henry 1,000,000 gold crowns in 2 installments in exchange for Princess Henry's marriage to the infant Dauphin Henri. On June the 9th, the feats of arms began with around 200 total riders taking part in a series of jousts. The good cheer and amity continued for 2 weeks despite some poor weather. Both Francis and Henry participated vigorously. Francis got a black eye and a bloody nose while competing with the Earl of Devon. Henry managed to kill one of his own favorite horses. Now, Wolsey and the French ambassadors had taken great pains to make sure that neither king was ever embarrassed. Under no circumstances were the two men ever to compete against one another directly. This worked until June 13th, when in the afternoon, after a rather large amount of wine had been consumed, and after seeing an English wrestler lose to a Breton, Henry impetuously decided to challenge Francis to a bout. It was precisely the kind of risk that Wolsey had desperately wanted to avoid. Henry outweighed Francis, but unbeknownst to Henry, Francis had been studying a new wrestling technique. Within seconds, Henry found himself unceremoniously tossed to the floor. Henry tried to laugh it off and asked for another bout. Francis, wisely, declined. Fortunately for everyone, Henry won a victory later in an archery contest. A more dangerous breach of protocol occurred on June the 17th. Without telling anyone, Francis got up early, rode to the English camp, burst into Henry's chamber while the English king still slept, and proclaimed himself to be Henry's prisoner. He declared that as a prisoner, he would serve as Henry's valet and help the king get dressed. Far from supplication, Francis's real message here was that he was Henry's equal. Henry again laughed it off and referred to Francis as brother throughout the balance of the day. But the incident showed Francis at his best and his worst. His boldness worked, and Henry compliantly acquiesced to Francis's demand that he respect his sovereign. But it could have gone very poorly. And as we will see, Francis did not always get a lucky throw of the dice. The two kings then agreed to found and maintain a chapel to Our Lady of Peace at the site of the meeting. On June 23rd, the two men shared one last feast and then departed. Yet, as Erasmus himself predicted, little to nothing came of the meeting. That chapel? Well, it was never built. And within only 3 years, England and France were once again at war with each other. By June 25th, Francis was back in Paris, no doubt trying to figure out how the heck he was going to pay for that elaborate farce. On July 10th, Henry and Catherine rode to Grevines outside Calais, where they met with Charles V as planned. The two men agreed to a secret treaty, wherein neither would make any new alliances with France for 2 years. Then, they agreed to meet in 1 year's time. Francis, back in Paris, heard about their meeting and worried. In the interim, Henry sailed back to England. As for Charles, he had other problems to contend with. In October 1520, he met with the electors at Aachen to formally accept the imperial crown. He took an oath to uphold the traditions and rights of the electors. He agreed that only Latin and German would be the language of the government, and that only Germans would be given offices. Are you starting to understand why Francis and Henry had no chance of winning the post now? Charles also swore to protect the church and the faith. This was a very relevant oath, as Charles and his advisors quickly turned their attention to the upcoming imperial diet at Worms, where he would deal with Martin Luther. As we know, Luther's Protestant movement was quickly becoming synonymous with the growing German nationalism movement. Everyone, from German knights to cobblers to rural peasants and urban burghers, were rallying to the reformist cause. Charles was in a bind. He had taken an oath to defend his German subjects, but he had also taken an oath to defend the Roman Catholic faith. Increasingly, it seemed as though Charles would be unable to do both. If he could, Charles would need to act with almost surgical-like precision. On the 18th of April 1520, Luther stepped forward and made his case. Charles's role was to sit in judgment, and the following day he issued his decision. Quote, "I am born of the most Christian emperors of the German nation, of the Catholic kings of Spain, and the archdukes of Austria, the dukes of Burgundy, who were all to the death true sons of the Roman Church, defenders of the faith, of the sacred customs, degrees, and uses of its worship, who have bequeathed all this to me as my heritage." In attacking the traditions of the Church, in Charles's mind, Luther had attacked the three great European dynasties concentrated in Charles's very own person. He could not and would not tolerate it. For the emperor, history was God's witness. Quote, "It is certain that a single monk must err if he stands against the opinion of all of Christendom. Otherwise, Christendom itself would have erred for more than 1,000 years. From now on, I regard Martin Luther as a monstrous heretic." End quote. He didn't realize it at the time, but his view of history was absolutely correct. From a historical perspective, the battle lines between Protestants and Catholics really do overshadow our view of European history since October the 31st, 1517. However, the more immediate problem for Charles remained Spain. Adrian of Utrecht, the Flemish governor of Spain, and you can probably already see where the problem is going to be, promptly alienated his natural allies in the Spanish nobility and then sat back to watch the rebellion unfold. The royalists in Spain now found themselves facing an organized and well-funded comunero movement, which could draw income from the towns that supported it, as well as from tax receipts due to the crown. Hence, Charles's own taxes were now funding the rebellion against him. In May 1520, just as Charles was meeting with Henry VIII, the comuneros led an army of 2,000 infantry and 200 cavalry to Toledo. When they arrived, they found that the royalists had already abandoned the town, making for Medina, where Adrian was shocked to find that the wealthy burghers barred the gates against him. Moreover, within the town, a running battle between said burghers and the royal garrison saw the garrison flee, but not before setting large swaths of the city on fire. The news that Governor Adrian had burned down chunks of Medina quickly drove his popularity to new lows. In a move that was potentially devastating to Charles, the comuneros then took Tordesillas, with Juana the Mad inside. She came to the balcony and welcomed the comuneros, whose commander knelt before her and saluted her as queen. This was a big problem. As I mentioned, Charles technically ruled Castile through his mother. If she was suddenly queen again, then he would have lost half of Spain. Adrian wrote, warning Charles that if Juana signed even one official document as queen, then he was finished. But she didn't. Instead, crazy old Juana seemed to be playing the comuneros quite well. drawing them out and getting them to reveal their hand before she made any moves herself. Perhaps she was not so mad, after all. As an aside, Juana is a deeply tragic, and still today, enigmatic figure in Spanish history. She was beautiful, we know that, and her love for Philip I was almost borderline unhealthy. But beyond that, Juana has been interpreted and reinterpreted over time. 19th century historians thought that she was a hysterical attention seeker. In the 20th century, a new brood of historians fell over themselves, trying to classify her as a schizophrenic. Today, feminists consider her the victim of misogyny, which she almost certainly was to some extent, but that's because every woman was, to some extent, in the 16th century. To me, it seemed like her insanity was the product of timing and choice. Eccentricity was probably a better word, and it might have been the only tool available to Juana, and so she deployed it as she could. Henry VIII admitted as much on the one occasion that he met her. Quote, "She seemed very well and spoke with a good manner and countenance, without losing a point of her authority. And although her husband and those who came with her depicted her as crazy, I did not see her as other than sane." End quote. Juana, born 1479, was the eldest daughter of Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon. She gave birth to Charles of Ghent at the age of 21. When Queen Isabella died, Juana and Philip had traveled to Spain to receive the fealty of Castile. But her husband Philip died almost immediately after we arrived, as we know. Isabella's crown should have passed to Juana, but Ferdinand wanted it for himself and for Spain to remain united. Certainly, we can say Juana was very overcome with grief after Philip's death. In fact, she refused to leave the sarcophagus. Not long after, Ferdinand took control over her household and absconded with her youngest son, also named Ferdinand. At this, Juana seems to have plunged into a deep depression. The sources report her sleeping and eating little and caring nothing for her personal appearance or hygiene. Then again, her beloved husband was dead, and all her children either accidentally absent or deliberately taken from her. I'm not super shocked at the depression. But from that moment on, Juana became Juana la Loca, or the Mad, as history has known her ever since. She spent much of the rest of her life imprisoned at Tordesillas. Charles, we know, loved his mother deeply. Her death in 1555 seems to have been the final nail in the coffin in terms of his decision to abdicate. But right now, Juana was 35 years from her death, and very much the center of attention. From September 1520 on, the tiny town of Tordesillas became the seat of the only effective, albeit limited, government in Castile. This is because the Comuneros wanted the veneer of legitimacy that the physical presence of Juana provided. The Comunero patriots seem to have had an instinctive understanding of how power and authority worked in Castile, namely that it was vested in the crown and the people of Castile, and not in the physical person of the monarch. In the fall of 1520, they took the time to draw up a document which many historians call a manifesto, which seems a lot more like a Bill of Rights to me. The document is wide-reaching and a common-sense explanation of what needed to be fixed and how to fix it. The Comuneros' chief complaint remained the succession. They wanted Charles to marry someone approved by the Cortes, who could then lead Castile in Charles's absence. Almost certainly, they were thinking of Isabella of Portugal. The Comuneros then sought to restrict all Flemings from participating in Castile's government. Instead, they wanted to return to the old guard, where the Castilian nobility saw to its local needs. Furthermore, they wanted to guarantee that Seville retain its monopoly on all trade with the New World. Right now, Castile was reaping a fortune from the produce of the Americas, and that could only be imported through Seville. They worried that the Flemish and other subjects of Charles' vast empire would now try to horn in on their racket. Finally, the Comuneros, refreshingly, wanted to put limits on the encomienda system in the New World, citing the fact that the natives were Christians now, and that the system was ruinous to the colony in general. For a few weeks in the early autumn of 1520, it really looked like these radicals might seize control of the Castilian government with Juana as their figurehead sovereign. And then it fizzled out. Like so many rebellions throughout the ages, the Comuneros were held together by only a few common interests. In this case, resistance to Charles and an aggressive xenophobia toward the Flemish. Once they had the upper hand, however, petty local squabbles took over. The peasantry took control of the movement, at which time it gained a virulent anti-aristocratic flavor, which then pushed away the nobles who had previously supported it. The urban burghers did not like the anti-capitalism stance of the rural poor either, and sought to distance themselves from a movement that seemed to be careening out of control. Worse still, rebel militias began attacking fortresses owned by local landlords, which forced them to choose a side, and they sided with Charles, now seeing the Comuneros as their enemies. By January of 1521, the Comuneros lost their best noble leader after he was implicated in embezzling Comunero funds and was stripped of his office 1 month later. On April 23, 1521, the rebel army tried to break out from a small fortress and marched to the well-fortified city of Toro to await reinforcements. But rather than confront a nearby royal cavalry force, which outnumbered the rebel horse by a 2-to-1 margin, on a defensible hillside, the rebel officers ignored commands and pressed on to a local hamlet, exposing the infantry to the royal cavalry amongst gently rolling farmland. By the time the royalist infantry even reached the battlefield, it was all over, and the rebels had been routed. Only Toledo now held out, and did so only through February 1522. During the Comunero Revolt, I should note how Francis I tried to use the chaos in Castile as an opportunity to take the much smaller frontier kingdom of Navarre. A French army marched to the capital of Pamplona on May 10, 1521, and placed it under siege. While the French were able to take the town, they then advanced into Castile itself, where the united Spaniards met them and easily forced Francis's men back across the border. All in all, nothing came of the invasion. By the time Charles returned to Castile in July 1522, with 4,000 German troops, just in case, the Comunero Revolt was over. Understanding the financial value of Castile to his empire, Charles was lenient. He executed 23 rebels, but then signed a general pardon, excluding around 296 men, who kept their lives but lost much of their fortunes. Next week, Henry and Charles wrangle with issues of succession, while Francis discovers that holding on to Milan is even more difficult than taking it. If you're interested in more content, check out the links in the show notes to the website, the patrons feed for ad-free versions of the show, and for a 7-day free trial of Western Civ 2.0.